it's recording. Hey, Lucy. Lucy. Say hi. Say hi, Lucy. Hi. I promised that you would see my dog and that would entice you or should entice you to come watch these videos. So this is Lucy. Lucy is a golden doodle, and I like to pretend she's a puppy, but she's about 50 pounds, and she's very cute, and probably not good for the spread of viruses. She's licking my face. So that's my dog. Excellent. So yeah, so when we left off on Monday, we were talking about the problem with cross-sectional surveys in allowing you to make or draw conclusions about causal relationships, right? So the big issue here is that when you do a survey at one point in time, you're getting a snapshot. And so this is why I use that example about the film Inside Out. So let me show you. I believe that this should work, I think. Yeah, there. Okay. So here is, go here, there. So here's the snapshot that we talked about. We talked about how here is Riley, who is the star of this film Inside Out, and we see her and she seems upset and she's eating Chinese food, right? So we ask ourselves, why is she upset? What is actually the cause of this? When you have a snapshot at one point in time, it looks as though, I don't know, maybe she's allergic to Chinese food, or she doesn't like what she got to eat for dinner, or she's, I don't know, upset because they accidentally gave her Diet Coke in her cup instead of regular Coke. The problem is, when you have a snapshot at one point in time, it makes it appear as though the two things that are happening simultaneously are actually causally related to one another. And they're not necessarily, right? Like in this situation, the reason that Riley is upset, as we know because we've seen earlier in the film what has happened, is that her parents have moved to San Francisco. She's away from her friends. She thinks she's not going to be able to play ice hockey anymore. That is the reason for her being upset. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to capture with the idea of the difference between having the ability to look at a process over time and having a snapshot at one point in time. The problem really is you do not have that time order captured. We know that. The other problem has to do with these third variables. Remember, we talked about how third variables are constructs or variables that can affect both the thing you think is the independent variable and the thing you think is the dependent variable. If you have a third variable that's operating in the background of this relationship, it could be that that third variable is causing those things and that the things aren't causing each other at all. So in fact, here, you could look at this as a third variable situation too with Riley, where here she is, they just moved. Because they just moved, they don't have any of their belongings yet, and they don't even have kitchen supplies to be able to cook dinner, hence they had to order out Chinese food. They just moved, and she is sad about it, hence her sad face. So now you have two things that look like they are causally related, but they're not because of a third variable. So let's see if we can come up with what is the best way to address causality. The best way to address causality is through the completion of a true experiment. Experiments, just like what you did back when you used to do the science fair, or maybe only I did the science fair, where you randomly assign things to experimental conditions. In the context of media effects research, you are randomly assigning people to view something or not. You're randomly assigning them to consume some kind of content or not. You're randomly assigning them to play a video game or not, okay? It is that random assignment that allows you to be able to draw causal conclusions. One, because when you do an experiment, you generally will have some kind of measure of the thing you think will be affected by media content, right? So maybe the attitude or the behavior. You measure that, right? Then you give the media exposure, and then you measure that behavior or attitude again. So you have time order because you have baseline attitude, the experimental manipulation where they're viewing this content or not, and then you have the behavior or attitude that you measured after. So you actually know that it came first because you're the one who made it happen. Okay. The bigger issue with this and what experiments are great for is eliminating these third variable problems, right? Those things that are in the background that are causing self-selection into media audiences and the thing you think is the outcome, right? Experiments eliminate all third variables. At least they do when you use randomization to experimental condition, which we'll spend some time talking about. So, experimental manipulations. The reason that experiments are wonderful is because the independent variable, the thing you think is causing the outcome, is something that the researcher manipulates. You manipulate the independent variable. Now, if you're thinking about this in the context of hard sciences or maybe like a science fair project, you can do a very simple experiment like, what is the effect of water on the number of seeds that will germinate out of dirt? Okay, so perhaps you have an experimental condition and a control condition. Perhaps your control condition, you don't give any water at all. The experimental condition, you give water. You put 10 seeds in the soil of each pot. Okay, great. 10 seeds in each pot. The independent variable is the amount of water that you are giving to these seeds. In your experimental group, perhaps you water it several times a day. The control group, nothing. The dependent variable, the Y variable, is the fraction or proportion of seeds that end up sprouting. Okay, maybe you give it a week, let's say. So after a week, how many of the seeds sprout? Well, in your experimental group, 9 out of the 10 seeds sprouted, and in the control group that, that was dying of thirst all week, none of those seeds sprouted, okay? Independent variable is water, dependent variable is the number of seeds that sprouted. So experiments actively manipulate your independent variable. We, as the researchers, create that variation, right? So the scientists here in this little seed experiment created the variation. In what? In the amount of water they gave the seeds. Okay, what does this have to do with media effects? Well, in media effects experiments, instead of seeds, we're watering people. We're not watering people. We're doing things to people. But instead of seeds, we have people. But instead of growth, perhaps we're witnessing changes in attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge, okay? Instead of just whether or not we germinate, we're witnessing changes in attitudes, behavior, and knowledge. Generally speaking, those are the kinds of effects we are really interested in, okay? So the kind of manipulation we are doing when we're looking at these media effects experiments are manipulations in media exposure. To do that, we use groups, okay? So we have, instead of pots of seeds, right, we have groups of people. And for those groups of people, we manipulate their levels of the independent variable. We have an experimental group. Perhaps for the experimental group, perhaps, let's go back. Let's say that we want to look at the effects of violent video games or violent programming on aggressive behaviors. Right? The most studied hypothesis, most studied relationship in media effects research. So perhaps we create an experimental group. They get the treatment group, and we have them exposed to 2 hours of violent television programming, okay? We also have a control group. These are participants who we're also studying, but they are not being exposed to violent programming. Perhaps instead, we expose them to non-violent programming. This raises an interesting question, folks, because I'm going to have you put on your thinking caps for a second. What if we have an experimental group where participants are exposed to 2 hours of violent programming, and we have a control group where the participants are exposed to nothing at all? no media. And then at the end of the study, we find a difference in their level of aggression. At the end of the study, what if we find that the people exposed to 2 hours of violent programming were more aggressive than the people who consumed no media content? What would be the limitation there? The real limitation is that if you have just violent media exposure and no media exposure, you're not going to know whether or not it was the violent programming that actually caused that aggression, or if it was just watching any kind of media that caused that aggression. This is why when we do media effects research, we want our conditions to be as similar as possible. Just like in any kind of science fair experiment that you've done, like in middle school, right, with the seeds. You want those conditions to be as similar as possible. So in the experimental group, 2 hours of violent programming is what they're exposed to. Then maybe in the control group, you also expose them to 2 hours of programming, but it just so happens that you give them non-violent programming. The big joke in communication research is that we tend to show people travel videos. I'm not sure why, but I guess because they're kind of like innocuous and it's like vanilla. It's like, it's there, you're watching something. It doesn't have a lot of sexual content, not a lot of obscenities, I would assume, not a lot of violence. Okay, so those are our two conditions in this example. So as a result, the amount of violent programming to which these subjects or these participants are exposed has been artificially manipulated by us, the researchers. We manipulate exposure. I'm going to pause this, and then we're going to continue in another video where I'm going to talk about exactly how this works and what the key element is for experiments to be successful.